The chocolate cake sat half-eaten on the table, 8 colorful candles still smoking from Jake's birthday wish. I watched my nephew blow out the flames with the same smile I'd seen 100 times before. But everything was about to change in ways I never could have imagined. "Aunt Sarah, did you see me blow them all out in one breath?" Jake grinned, chocolate frosting smeared across his cheek. His innocent brown eyes sparkled with joy, completely unaware that his world was about to be turned upside down. "I sure did, buddy," I managed to say, my voice still hoarse from crying at David's funeral just 5 days earlier. The black dress I wore felt heavy against my skin, a constant reminder that my husband was gone forever. Emma, my younger sister, had insisted on having Jake's birthday party despite everything. "Life goes on, Sarah," she'd said. "The kids need some happiness right now." I'd agreed, thinking it might help distract me from the crushing grief that followed me everywhere. The small gathering included Emma's neighbors, a few of Jake's school friends, and their parents. Everyone spoke in hushed tones, stealing glances at me with those pitying looks I'd grown to hate. The widow, the woman whose husband died too young at 37. Emma stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor of her tiny apartment. The room fell silent. She looked different somehow, nervous but determined, like she was about to jump off a cliff. "Everyone, I have something important to say," Emma announced, her voice shaking slightly. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Something that changes everything." I felt a chill run down my spine. Something in her tone made my stomach twist with dread. "Jake," Emma said, looking down at her son who was still picking at his cake. "You know how you've always wondered about your daddy?" Jake nodded slowly, suddenly serious. He'd asked about his father countless times over the years. Emma always gave vague answers about a man who wasn't ready to be a father and had left before Jake was born. Emma's hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. "Well, your daddy was someone very special. Someone who loved you very much, even though he couldn't be with us." My heart started pounding. Where was this going? "Jake's father," Emma said, her voice growing stronger, "was David, Sarah's husband." The room erupted in gasps and whispers. I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. The cake fork slipped from my hand and clattered onto the plate. "That's impossible," I whispered. But Emma wasn't finished. She waved the paper in the air triumphantly. "I have David's real will right here, the one where he admits Jake is his son and leaves him half of everything, including half of Sarah's house. The $800,000 house that David and I had bought together, our dream home, the place where we'd planned to raise our own children someday." "Emma, what are you talking about?" I stood up, my legs feeling weak. "David would have told me we didn't have secrets." "Oh, but you did," Emma said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "David came to me 9 years ago, right after Jake was born. He begged me not to tell you, said it would destroy your marriage." The other parents started gathering their children, sensing the family drama unfolding. But I barely noticed them leaving. My entire world was crashing down around me. "You're lying," I said, but my voice sounded small and uncertain. Emma's smile grew wider. "The DNA test is right here, too. Jake is David's son, which makes him entitled to half of everything David owned, including your precious house." I stared at my sister. This woman I'd trusted my whole life, who I'd helped through her divorce, who I'd given money to when she couldn't pay rent. The woman whose children I'd babysat countless times, including Jake, who I'd grown to love like my own. And then, despite everything, despite the shock, the betrayal, the impossible claim, I started to laugh. It started as a small chuckle, but it grew louder and more intense until I was laughing so hard that tears streamed down my face. Emma's confident expression faltered, replaced by confusion and growing anger. "What's so funny?" she demanded. "This isn't a joke, Sarah. I'm taking what's rightfully Jake's." I wiped my eyes and looked at my sister with a mixture of pity and something else, something that felt almost like relief. "Oh, Emma," I said, still catching my breath from laughing. You have no idea what you've just done. You see, there's something about David that you don't know. Something that makes your little plan completely impossible. Emma's face went pale. What are you talking about? I smiled, feeling calmer than I had since David's funeral. Because my husband, 10 years earlier, I met David at a coffee shop downtown. He was sitting alone, reading a business magazine, and when he looked up and smiled at me, I knew my life was about to change. He had this way of making everything seem possible, like the world was full of opportunities just waiting for us to grab them. Our wedding was everything I'd dreamed of. Emma was my maid of honor, spinning around in her lavender dress and telling everyone who would listen how lucky I was. Sarah found her prince, she kept saying. And it felt true. David was successful, kind, and completely devoted to me. The first few years were magical. David's business was growing fast, and we bought our dream house, a beautiful colonial with 4 bedrooms and a big backyard. Room for all the kids we're going to have, David would say, pulling me close as we stood in what would become the nursery. But the kids never came. Month after month, we tried. I took vitamins, tracked my cycle, and did everything the doctors suggested. David held my hand through every appointment, every test, every disappointment. The doctors couldn't find anything wrong with either of us. Sometimes these things just take time, they said. After 3 years of trying, the strain started to show. David threw himself into work, taking longer business trips and staying late at the office. I threw myself into being the perfect wife, cooking elaborate dinners that often went cold because he was stuck in meetings. I'm sorry, honey, he'd say, kissing my forehead when he finally came home. This deal is huge. Once it goes through, I'll have more time for us. But there was always another deal, another trip, another reason why our life had to wait. Emma's life was falling apart around the same time mine felt stuck. Her husband Mark had been cheating on her, and when she found out, their marriage exploded in a mess of lawyers and custody battles. She moved into a tiny apartment with baby Jake and 6-year-old Lisa, struggling to make ends meet on her part-time job at a dental office. I don't know how I'm going to do this alone, Emma cried to me one evening, bouncing Jake on her hip while Lisa colored at my kitchen table. Mark barely pays child support, and what he does pay doesn't cover anything. I looked at Jake, this tiny baby with the biggest brown eyes I'd ever seen, and my heart ached. Here was Emma with 2 beautiful children she couldn't afford to raise properly, while David and I had everything we needed except the one thing we wanted most. You're not alone, I told her. You have me and David. We're family. And we were. Emma and the kids became regular fixtures at our house. David seemed to love having them around, especially Jake. He'd spend hours playing with him, teaching him to throw a baseball in our backyard, reading him bedtime stories when Emma had to work late. You're so good with him, I told David one night after we'd put Jake to bed in our guest room. You're going to be an amazing father someday. David's smile seemed forced. Yeah, someday. Emma never talked about Jake's father. When people asked, she'd get this closed-off look and change the subject. He's not in the picture, was all she'd ever say. It's better this way. I respected her privacy, but sometimes I wondered. Jake didn't look anything like Mark or Emma. He had these distinctive features, the shape of his nose, the way his hair curled at the back of his neck. Sometimes I'd catch David staring at Jake with this strange expression I couldn't quite read. What are you thinking about? I'd ask. Nothing, he'd say quickly. Just wondering what our kids will look like. David started giving Emma money regularly. She's struggling, he'd explain when I found the checks he'd written. Jake needs new clothes and Lisa's starting school. We can afford to help. I never questioned it. David was generous with everyone and Emma was my sister. Of course we should help. But looking back now, I remember other things. The way David's phone would buzz with texts when Emma was around and how he'd quickly put it away. The expensive toys that would appear in Jake's room. Toys that Emma claimed came from a friend at work. The way David would volunteer to babysit when Emma needed to go out, insisting I didn't need to stay home too. "You go have fun with your book club," he'd say. "Jake and I will be fine here." I thought I was married to the most wonderful man in the world. A man who loved his family, who was generous and kind, who was just waiting for the right moment for us to start our own family. I had no idea that the perfect marriage I thought I was living was built on lies that would eventually destroy everything I believed about the man I loved. The heart attack came without warning on a Tuesday morning in March. David was getting ready for work, adjusting his tie in our bedroom mirror, when he suddenly grabbed his chest and collapsed. I called 911, performed CPR like they taught us in that class we took years ago, but it was too late. The paramedics worked on him for 40 minutes before the doctor finally said the words that shattered my world. "I'm sorry. There's nothing more we can do." At 37, David was gone. The funeral was a blur of flowers, condolences, and people telling me how sorry they were for my loss. Emma stood beside me at the graveside, holding my hand as they lowered David's casket into the ground. She'd been my rock through everything, taking care of the arrangements I couldn't handle, making sure I ate, answering phone calls from people I couldn't bear to talk to. "He was too young," she kept saying. "It's not fair, Sarah. It's just not fair." But even in my grief, I noticed something odd about Emma's behavior. While I was drowning in sorrow, she seemed almost anxious. Not just sad, but worried about something specific. "What happens now?" she asked me the day after the funeral as we sat in my kitchen, surrounded by casserole dishes from neighbors. "I mean, with David's business and everything?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "Mr. Peterson is handling all the legal stuff. David always took care of the finances." Emma nodded, but she kept fidgeting with her coffee cup. "Did David ever mention... did he have any other accounts or anything? Besides the main ones?" The question struck me as strange. "Why would you ask that?" "Oh, no reason," Emma said quickly. "I just want to make sure you're taken care of. You know how men can be about keeping their wives informed about money stuff." But David hadn't been like that. He'd always been open about our finances, showing me the bank statements, discussing major purchases. Or so I thought. The reading of David's will took place the following week in Mr. Peterson's oak-paneled office. It was straightforward. Everything went to me. The house, the business, the savings accounts, the life insurance. David had been thorough and generous, making sure I'd be financially secure for the rest of my life. "Your husband was a very organized man," Mr. Peterson said, sliding the documents across his desk. "Everything is in order." But Emma wasn't satisfied. She'd insisted on coming to the reading, claiming she wanted to support me, but her reaction to the will was unexpected. "That's it?" she asked, leaning forward in her chair. "There's nothing else? No other documents?" Mr. Peterson looked confused. "This is David's complete will, executed just 6 months ago. Is there something specific you were expecting?" Emma's face flushed red. "No, I thought maybe there might be something for the kids. You know, Jake and Lisa. David loved them so much." "David did mention them," Mr. Peterson said, flipping through the pages. "There's a provision here for their college funds, $50,000 each, to be held in trust until they turn 18. I was touched. Even in death, David was taking care of my sister's children, but Emma looked almost angry. "That's all?" she pressed. "Nothing else?" "Emma, what's wrong with you?" I asked. David was incredibly generous. Most people don't leave anything to their niece and nephew. She backed down then, apologizing and claiming she was just emotional, but something felt off. Over the next few days, as I started going through David's papers, I found things that didn't make sense. Bank statements showing regular transfers to an account I'd never heard of. Credit card charges at restaurants I'd never been to, always on days when David claimed to be in business meetings. Hotel receipts from cities where he supposedly had clients, but the dates didn't match his travel calendar. And then there were the phone records, hundreds of calls and texts to a number I didn't recognize, often late at night or early in the morning when I was asleep. When I called the number, Emma answered. "Sarah? Why are you calling from David's phone?" My blood ran cold. "Emma, why is your number all over David's phone bill?" There was a long pause. We talked sometimes, about the kids, about you. He was worried about you, Sarah. The fertility stuff was really getting to him. But the calls had started years ago, long before our fertility struggles became serious. And some of them lasted for hours. "Emma, I need you to tell me the truth. What was going on between you and David?" Another pause, longer this time. "Nothing, Sarah, I swear. We were just friends. He cared about Jake and Lisa, that's all." But I could hear the lie in her voice. And suddenly, Emma's strange behavior at the will reading made perfect sense. She'd been expecting something she thought David had promised her, something that would explain why my husband had been secretly talking to my sister for years, transferring money to hidden accounts, and lying to me about where he'd been. The perfect marriage I thought I'd had was starting to look like a carefully constructed illusion, and I was finally beginning to see the cracks in the foundation. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw David's face, wondering how many lies he'd told me over the years. By morning, I'd made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks ago. I was going to hire someone to investigate my own husband. Marcus Webb was a private investigator who specialized in financial fraud. His office was small and cluttered, nothing like the polished law firms David used to frequent. But his reputation was solid, and right now I needed answers more than I needed comfort. "I want to know everything," I told him, sliding a check across his desk. "Every account, every transaction, every secret my husband kept from me." Marcus was thorough. Within a week, he'd uncovered a web of financial activity that made my head spin. David had been living a double life, and the evidence was all there in black and white. The secret account Emma had asked about? It existed. David had been transferring $2,000 every month for the past 8 years, always on the 15th, like clockwork. The account was in Emma's name, but the deposits came from a business account I'd never known about. "Your husband was very careful," Marcus explained, spreading the bank statements across his desk. "He set up this account through his business, probably to keep it off your joint tax returns. But here's what's interesting. The payments increased significantly 3 years ago. 3 years ago, right around the time our fertility struggles had become most intense, when David started working longer hours and taking more business trips." "There's more," Marcus continued. "I found receipts for a DNA testing lab. Multiple tests, actually, all paid for by your husband over the past 5 years." My hands shook as I looked at the receipts. "DNA tests for what?" "That's what we need to find out." I confronted Emma that afternoon at her apartment. She was folding laundry while Jake played video games and Lisa watched cartoons. The picture of domestic normalcy, except now I knew it was funded by my husband's secret payments. "We need to talk," I said, closing the door behind me. "About the money David was giving you." Emma's face went white. She glanced at the kids, then back at me. "I don't know what you mean." $2,000 a month for 8 years, Emma. That's almost $200,000. What was it for? Emma sank onto her couch, the laundry basket falling to the floor. For a moment, I thought she might deny it again. Then her shoulders sagged in defeat. "It was child support," she whispered. "For Jake." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Child support?" "David is Jake's father, Sarah. I've been trying to tell you, but I didn't know how." I stared at my nephew, this little boy I'd helped raise, who'd slept in my guest room countless times, who called me Aunt Sarah with such love in his voice. "That's impossible. You were married to Mark when Jake was born." "Mark and I were separated," Emma said, tears streaming down her face. "We got back together when I found out I was pregnant, but Jake isn't his. David and we had an affair. Just once, I swear. It was a mistake, but Jake happened." The room spun around me. "You're lying." Emma jumped up and ran to her bedroom, returning with a manila envelope. "Here's the DNA test. David insisted on it when I told him Jake might be his. Look at it, Sarah. The results don't lie." My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. The official letterhead, the scientific terminology, the conclusion that made my world collapse. Probability of paternity, 99.97%. David was Jake's father. "He wanted to tell you," Emma continued, her voice desperate. "But you were trying so hard to get pregnant and he was afraid it would destroy you. So we agreed to keep it secret. He'd support Jake financially, but that was it." "That was it?" I laughed bitterly. "Emma, he was paying you almost as much as some people make in a year. And all those phone calls, all those secret meetings. We had to coordinate things. Jake's school expenses, medical bills, making sure our stories stayed straight. David loved that boy, Sarah. He wanted to be part of his life, but he loved you more." I looked at the DNA test again, studying every detail. Something nagged at me about it, but I couldn't put my finger on what. "There's something else," Emma said quietly. "David left another will, a real one that acknowledges Jake as his son and leaves him half of everything." She pulled out the document she'd waved at Jake's birthday party. It looked official, complete with David's signature and a notary stamp. But as I read it, that nagging feeling grew stronger. Something about this whole situation felt wrong, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. And I was going to find out exactly what Emma was hiding from me. Something about that DNA test bothered me all night. The paper felt too new, too crisp for a document that was supposedly 5 years old. And David's signature on the will looked slightly different from the one I'd seen him write thousands of times. The next morning, I called Marcus Webb with a new request. "I need you to verify these documents," I told him. "And I want an independent DNA test done on Jake. Don't tell Emma." "You think she's lying?" "I think my sister has been playing a very dangerous game." Marcus worked fast. Within 2 days, he had answers that changed everything. "The DNA test is fake," he said, sliding a report across his desk. "I had a forensic document examiner look at it. The letterhead is real. They copied it from the actual lab's website, but the test was never performed. The signature of the lab technician, it belongs to a woman who quit that job 3 years ago." My heart pounded. "What about the will?" "Also forged. The notary stamp is fake, and the signature analysis shows it's not your husband's handwriting. Someone practiced copying his signature, but they couldn't get the pressure points right." I felt sick. "So Jake isn't David's son?" "I had the independent DNA test done using hair samples from Jake's brush and a sample from David's razor. No biological relationship whatsoever." Emma had been lying about everything. "But here's what's really interesting," Marcus continued. "I traced those monthly payments more carefully. They didn't start as child support. They started as blackmail." He showed me a series of emails he'd recovered from David's business computer. The first one was from Emma, sent 8 years ago. "David, I know what you did at the Henderson Project. The falsified inspection reports, the bribes to city officials. I have copies of everything. We need to talk." David's response was desperate. "Emma, please, if this comes out, it will destroy my business and my marriage. What do you want?" Emma's reply was simple. $2,000 a month, forever, and you'll be a good uncle to my kids." I stared at the emails in shock. She was blackmailing him? For years. But then something changed 3 years ago. Look at this. Marcus showed me another email exchange. Emma had gotten greedier, demanding more money and threatening to tell me about David's business dealings. But David had fought back. "I've had enough, Emma. I've been paying you for 5 years for something that could have been handled with a simple fine. I'm done." Emma's response was vicious. "Fine. Then I'll tell Sarah that Jake is your son. I have a DNA test that proves it. How do you think she'll handle that news while she's struggling with infertility?" "She threatened to destroy our marriage with a fake paternity claim," I whispered. Your husband was trapped, Marcus said gently. He couldn't expose her blackmail without admitting to the business fraud, and he couldn't let her destroy your marriage with lies about Jake, so he kept paying. The final piece of the puzzle came from David's laptop. Marcus had found a draft email, never sent, dated just 2 weeks before David's death. Emma, I've hired a private investigator to look into your claims about Jake. When the truth comes out, and it will, you'll be facing charges for fraud, forgery, and extortion. I'm also turning myself in to the authorities about the Henderson project. I'd rather face the consequences of my mistakes than live under your threats anymore. This ends now. David had been planning to expose Emma and confess his own crimes. The stress of it all, the years of blackmail and lies, had probably contributed to his heart attack. I drove to Emma's apartment with the evidence, my hands shaking with rage. She answered the door with a smile that faded when she saw my face. "We need to talk," I said, pushing past her into the living room. "About your fake DNA test, your forged will, and the 8 years you spent blackmailing my husband." Emma's face went completely white. "Sarah, I don't know what you're talking about." "Stop lying." I slammed the documents on her coffee table. "I know everything, Emma. The Henderson project, the fake paternity test, all of it." Emma collapsed into a chair, her hands covering her face. "You don't understand," she sobbed. "I was desperate. Mark left me with nothing, and I had 2 kids to feed. David had so much money, and he'd made mistakes too. I just wanted him to help us." "Help you? You destroyed him. You made him live in fear for 8 years. I never meant for it to go this far," Emma cried. "But once it started, I couldn't stop. The gambling debts, the threats from loan sharks. I needed that money to survive." Gambling debts. Another lie revealed. "Jake isn't David's son," I said quietly. "You know it, I know it, and now I can prove it." Emma looked up at me with desperate eyes. "But he could have been. David loved that boy like his own son. Doesn't that count for something? What counts is that you're going to prison," I said, pulling out my phone, "and Jake and Lisa are going to learn the truth about their mother." As I dialed 911, I thought about David's final email, the one he never got to send. He'd been ready to face the truth, to accept the consequences of his mistakes, and free himself from Emma's web of lies. Now it was my turn to finish what he'd started. Detective Rodriguez arrived within an hour, along with 2 uniformed officers. Emma sat on her couch, still crying, while Jake and Lisa watched from the hallway with confused, frightened eyes. My heart broke for them. Innocent children about to learn that their mother was a criminal. "Mrs. Thompson," Detective Rodriguez said gently, "you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, extortion, and blackmail." As they read Emma her rights, she looked at me with desperate eyes. "Sarah, please, think about Jake and Lisa. They need their mother." "They needed their mother, to be honest," I replied. "Not a criminal who destroyed my husband's life." The next few hours were a whirlwind of police statements, evidence collection, and phone calls to social services. Jake and Lisa would stay with Emma's neighbor temporarily while the courts decided their fate. I wanted to take them myself, but the legal complications of Emma's crimes made that impossible for now. At the police station, Emma finally confessed everything. The gambling addiction that started after her divorce, the mounting debts to dangerous people who threatened her children, the desperate decision to blackmail David over a business mistake that could have been resolved years ago with a simple fine and apology. "I found out about the Henderson project by accident," she admitted to Detective Rodriguez, while I listened from behind one-way glass. "David left some papers at my apartment when he was babysitting Jake. I saw the inspection reports, the payments to city officials. I was so desperate for money, and David had so much. It seemed like the perfect solution." "And the fake paternity claim?" Detective Rodriguez asked. Emma's voice broke. "When David tried to stop paying, I panicked. I knew how much he and Sarah wanted children, how much the fertility struggles were hurting them both. I thought if I could make him believe Jake was his son, he'd keep paying to protect Sarah from the truth." So you forged DNA test results? I found a template online, copied the lab's letterhead. It wasn't hard. David was so stressed about everything, he didn't look too closely at the details. He just saw what he expected to see. The fake will had been Emma's final desperate gambit. When David died suddenly, she realized her blackmail income was gone forever. She'd forged the will hoping to claim half of David's estate, using Jake as her justification. I never meant to hurt anyone, Emma sobbed. I just wanted to take care of my kids. But her crimes had hurt everyone. David had lived his final years in constant stress and fear. I'd been robbed of the truth about my marriage, and Jake and Lisa were about to lose their mother to prison. The trial took 6 months. Emma pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for a reduced sentence of 5 years in prison. The judge was harsh but fair, noting that while Emma's desperation was understandable, her actions had caused immeasurable harm to multiple families. During the sentencing hearing, I stood up to address the court. My husband wasn't perfect, I said, looking directly at Emma. He made mistakes in his business that he should have faced honestly. But he didn't deserve 8 years of blackmail and fear. He didn't deserve to die believing he'd fathered a child through betrayal. And I didn't deserve to spend the last months of our marriage wondering why the man I loved seemed so distant and afraid. I paused, gathering my strength. But I also want the court to know that I'm petitioning for custody of Jake and Lisa. They're innocent victims in this, and they're still my family. Emma may have destroyed my trust, but she didn't destroy my love for those children. The custody hearing was emotional but straightforward. With Emma in prison and their father, Mark, having abandoned them years ago, I was the only stable family Jake and Lisa had left. The judge granted me temporary custody with the possibility of adoption if Emma agreed. Emma did agree in a tearful meeting at the prison 6 months later. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, she said through the glass partition, but thank you for taking care of them. They love you, Sarah. They always have. I love them too, I replied. That's why I'm doing this. Today, 2 years later, Jake is 10 and Lisa is 8. They call me Mom now, though we still talk about their birth mother and visit her when they're ready. They know the truth about what happened, age-appropriate versions of it, and they're in therapy to help them process everything. David's business mistakes were resolved with fines and community service, his reputation ultimately intact. The stress of Emma's blackmail had been far worse than the consequences of his actual crimes would have been. I still live in our house, the one Emma tried to claim. But now it's filled with the laughter of children, homework scattered on the kitchen table, and the chaos of family life that David and I always dreamed of. It's not the family we planned, but it's the family we were meant to have. And sometimes, the most beautiful things come from the most broken places. Emma's lies destroyed my marriage to David, but they also gave me Jake and Lisa. In the end, love won over deception, and truth prevailed over lies. That's why I laughed at Jake's birthday party, because I knew something Emma didn't, that David had been planning to expose her all along and that the truth would eventually set us all free.